Uh, Thank you for all of you for taking the time off to attend this webinar. I know many of you have registered, and it's nice to see so many of you actually take time off and attend this leadership webinar. I also thank ILSS and for all the arrangements. Nikita's already said what I do. Apart from running and apart from teaching leadership, I also run a few workshops around the world and for different people from different sectors, from the non-profit sector, from the government sector, and from the corporate sector. So it sort of gives me an appreciation and understanding of how leadership looks in different sectors, and so how possible it could look in the coming days after the post-COVID scenario as it emerges. Uh, I know that several of you sent a lot of questions to ILSS, and Nikita has shared many of them with me. I'll try to address them as I speak. And if I do, I know time is short. If I do not find the time to answer some of them, you can always raise them again during the Q&A session that we have. The format is very simple. I'll try to speak for 30 minutes, 35 minutes, trying to share some concepts on how does leadership look, how did it look in a pre-COVID world, how has COVID made a difference, what is it beyond just a pandemic, what else is happening that we need to understand from the perspective of leadership, and how do we move on ahead. No, I'm not going to spend time. I'm presuming that most of you who come on board are self-selected, and so you already know some bit of leadership. So I'm not going to spend time defining or explaining what leadership means. So I'm going to start with the presumption that most of us intuitively understand leadership in a particular way. A few of us might have read theories of leadership, taken seminars, books, workshops. We read about the great person theory. We read about the situation throwing up people to exercise leadership. We've seen about qualities of leadership. We've heard words like transactional, transformational, command and control, the kind of military leadership. So I'm not going to get into all that. But what I'm going to pick from them, I think all of them fundamentally have been different ways of looking at leadership at different points of time. And so there's nothing like right or wrong. So in a particular context, they really made a lot of sense. But as time went on and people discovered that one theory didn't fit a particular situation, new theories evolved. But what you see common in most of them is all of them look at leadership from a person's perspective, like that great guy out there. So it's very person-centric. But what I would like to slowly shift the discussion and the thinking itself is what is happening today, and will that person-centric approach really work in a post-COVID world? And if you see the way leadership is playing around the world, though we try to identify key political leaders or heads of government as people leading the fight against this COVID epidemic, but if you really break it down and deconstruct, you see a plethora of people, nameless, faceless people are actually coming together in their own ways. Why? Every one of us, every one of you out there, in your own way, is also trying to exercise leadership in this fight against the pandemic. So the shift has already begun from a person-centric focus. We're slowly moving towards an issue-centric perspective. So the issue suddenly becomes bigger than what we are. And so I just stop there for a minute and come back to it as I describe what's happening. So what I'm going to talk about is I explained earlier how I used to do trainings for the nonprofits. I used to do a lot of training for government and political leaders, academic institutions across the world, and also for young people and the corporate world of a lot of CEOs out there. And everybody came into the room with an understanding that leadership would be different for different sectors. Well, the general principles would be the same, but the basic driver would be essentially different because each sector served a different functionality. Now, the world of nonprofits, if they focused on, or the social sector like ILSS is now focusing on, if they focused on bringing about social change or making this world a better place in the way that all of us explained, the corporate world is very clear. They were driven by their bottom lines and their accountability to their shareholders or their promoters. The state had its own reason to exist, and it was driven by public interest about being responsible to citizens. So people actually thought that leadership would actually play out differently for different sectors. So, but if you really deconstruct leadership, it actually is not very different. Maybe the end result of why you exercise leadership might be manifesting differently, but the way you actually exercise leadership doesn't have to be very different. But that's a plus and a minus. If you look at today, and if we just go back to the way the COVID crisis has emerged, we see this fascinating blurring of boundaries. It's very difficult to say where the state stops and the citizens take over. Where does civil society groups actually begin and where does the state end? The boundary lines between the sectors of public, private, or the state have become very diffuse. A lot of corporate entities are actually not looking at bottom lines during this crisis. They're actually looking at serving society and they're looking at how do you make the problem go away. And you have an automobile manufacturer trying to 3D print face shields, or somebody else trying to make ventilators. They have nothing to do with medical equipment, but they're looking at a value that a ventilator can bring to the nation or to the world now. So these actual boundary lines are all redefining itself. But one thing that's emerging and something we all need to be very, very conscious about is suddenly the government has become very visible. Despite slogans like more governance, less government, it is the public sector which had actually stood up, actually faced the challenge in its entirety and tried to mobilize the entire nation and the citizens to actually fight this COVID epidemic. So in a very subtle way, the change of leadership, in my view, has already begun. And we need to really understand how do we build on this? Is this going to be sustainable? Is it going to continue? Or are we going to go back to business as usual after the crisis ends? The second thing is, I look at it this way, and pre-COVID, most of us, including if I look at my own life, we always looked at, what am I doing? What is it that I as a person am exercising in this context? So it's like I said earlier, it's about the person centricity, about I doing something, whichever sector we came from. What can I do to solve the problem? I can remember 30, 35 years ago when I started the Vivekananda movement, and at that time my intent was taking healthcare to rural India. And all that I was focused on was how do I build the hospital? How do I provide care to the people around the hospital? So I actually didn't stop to even ask myself, how is it that rural Indians can access healthcare services? Now there's a distinct difference in these two ways we look at it. From what do people need to ensure good health to what can I do to provide healthcare? There's a complete world of a difference. So I think this is something very important for us to internalize. Till now, till the pre-COVID era, the individual was so celebrated. The externalities around us and our ability to influence and control events and people outside of us was celebrated as great leadership. So it was about I doing something. And I think that is no longer going to be extremely relevant in the days to come. We were all, it is that phase of leadership was where one was driven by one's ego. And that's where the drive came from. It always involved position, power. It involved technical competence. And these were celebrated. To give an example that is quoted politically in our country is how a chaiwala can become a prime minister. So we celebrate becoming the prime minister. We celebrate the destination that most of us don't even ask ourselves, how did he even get there? What is the journey he took? What are the path he traveled? What are the challenges he faced? And where was leadership being exercised there? So it is the final position or the power that you are endowed with by attaining that position that we spoke about. So everything was about the individual and very little was spoken about the collective. So I think most theories were all drawn around this, and they all emanated strangely from the Western world and their appreciation of leadership. So a lot of this understanding of leadership, we must all understand as we unpack it, comes loaded with the cultural baggage of the West and that background of the West. So coming now to the crisis itself, I think this COVID crisis is dictating a new normal to all of us. Whether it is the space of healthcare, which is very easy to recognize. Being a physician, I know the challenges we're facing, the things you need to do in changing your behavior patterns, your very thinking, your very definition of how do you serve, whom do you serve, why do you serve, to the health system and its responses. The crisis has defined a new normal for what the government can do or cannot do. The government can tell you whether you can leave your homes or not leave your homes, how far you got to stand from the next person, you got to stand 2 meters away, and we have been told all this. The crisis is redefining higher education, even lower education possibly. Exams are getting cancelled, exams are getting postponed, students are being told you don't have to take an examination, you can go into the next year. We are redefining how one can respond in a crisis. Crisis management meant something earlier. Crisis management is completely different today. So everyday life as we know it, the economy as we know it, everything changed overnight. And possibly a lot of this is going to still remain the same way in the post-COVID world. So I also think beyond the visible change, a lot of things have changed very subtly. And what are the subtle changes? Like I mentioned earlier, I think sectoral differences have blurred. So it's about, and you need to keep this in mind because a post-COVID world, it's no longer about how do I run my non-profit. It's no longer about how can I be a good corporate CEO because the sectoral margins have blurred. It's about can I operate in this ecosystem where the blurring of the sectoral differences itself is going to be a challenge for me to operate in. Suddenly, we are all hit by the reality of human vulnerability. For once, the world now feels extremely vulnerable. It's not about the scientific attainment. It's not about how much we have done till now. We suddenly don't even know how to cope with even staying at home. We don't even know how to cope with spending 24 hours with the families, with not getting into a formal workplace, a brick and mortar structure where we're expected to work. So the separations are dimming out and we have to learn how to cope with it. More importantly, I think the real change is in our understanding of what constitutes value. Earlier, value was defined by our position, our power, the person. Eminence got a lot of value earlier. But today, suddenly, the newspaper boy who's unable to deliver your paper, or the janitor who's not able to come and clean your workplace, or your domestic help who's not able to reach your house to do what you can do, or the public transport system, everything has changed. So life in the last 1 month has helped us redefine what is value. It has redefined what are life's priorities itself. Now, it is strangely stimulated, possibly in several of us, the difficulty that many of us are yet to come to terms with the concept of time itself. It's very fascinating. The pre-COVID world, whomever you met, whomever you spoke to, everybody kept telling, I'm busy. Busy is a word which was very common, right? Every one of us seemed to be busy 24 hours a day. But suddenly, you have to come to terms with the fact that time as an entity, and it's staring at your face, and how do you negotiate, how do you manage it? The two other concepts which I think very abstract, and it's really hitting us hard and we don't really process it, is this concept of illness and death. It is very easy to come to terms with that. My friend had a heart attack and he went to hospital, he had a stent. These were known occurrences which had got internalized over generations. But suddenly when you're facing something, a small, tiny little nanoparticle shaped virus, which is redefining the way you see how diseases happen, how diseases progress, how they spread, and how they can threaten people. We don't have enough information to form any opinions. And the third quality is this extreme helplessness that we find. On one side, it's exposing our dependency on science and technology to solve our problems. But on the other side, we have yet to come to terms with the fact that several times it's the same science and technology which led us to this consumerist, greedy ecosystem that we have created, which has destroyed the planet as we know it. And therefore, in that sense of control, we're actually helpless. And this complicated dichotomy of emotions, I think, is a great opportunity for us to learn from. It's an opportunity for us to understand that dealing with uncertainty is possibly a great leadership trait. So the next thing that it's really emerging with the COVID crisis, as I understand, is the health of the planet, which we were not really seeing it on an everyday basis, right? My wife's health or my son's health or my daughter's health is something which I can talk to and understand, or my patient's health when he walks into the clinic is something we can relate to. And everything else, when you talk of climate justice or climate change or all this kind of concepts, they're somewhere out there, a problem that somebody else would handle. But it's hitting us now, the importance of health of the planet, the respect that we could give to other living organisms on the world, and this enormous interconnectedness that this world is demonstrating today. It's very strange. On one side, the globalization has resulted in all the challenges that you can find, including the pandemic. But it's actually the globalization which is also bringing us and making us feel so interconnected. One country can send medical equipment to the other, or can send masks and gloves to some other country, or even physicians to take care of the problem. And this challenge of interconnectedness with its own political tone and tenor but that's done. But more importantly, I think from the leadership perspective, this 1 month has also shown that change is possible. Change is possible and change can be done fast, which is also gives a lot of space for hope. So now let me move on to, if all this is a learning from the COVID crisis, how do we define and determine the leadership that we can demonstrate, or what is the leadership that we require to take humanity towards a better world? How do we really move in that space? So I would like to now focus on what is it that needs to be done, right? There is an immediate technical response, and we are all very good at it. We are all very good at responding from our technical competence. And that is why you will find the narrative right now. The narrative right now is about the race for a vaccine, the genomic sequencing of the virus, determining whether it's mutating or not. These are things which our technical capabilities makes us feel that we are in control of. So we all need that reassurance of control. And so if you look at it, it's all about that struggle for finding out the next vaccine for coronavirus, or to know whether hydroxychloroquine can work, or will it work, or what medical combination medicines will work. Because these are domains where we think we have expertise, and that itself is a problem, because when you live in a world where you think your expertise can solve it, you actually don't explore, are there any other ways we can solve this problem? And sometimes it also blinds you to ask yourself, am I even addressing what is causing the problem? So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we don't need leadership to develop a vaccine or new medicines. We need all that, because we need the short term to be addressed, the acute phase to be addressed, the crisis to be taken care of. But that is not going to be leadership. That is just going to be people in positions of power, authority, and technical competence coming to a solution for the short term. We need people to be doing that, but we also need people to actually look at what is going to be beyond that. What is the real root cause of all this? And do I know everything that I need to know? So can we focus on, do I know everything that I need to know? Which gives us a new way of looking at learning itself. So that is going to happen. So we need to know what kind of leadership will help us understand, how do I learn? Where is the space for learning? Is it in just brick and mortar institutions, or it is just around us? Is it just from people whom we look as professors, or is it there everywhere, and not just in people, but in everything that's operating in the ecosystem? Something else you got to also understand and focus on is system thinking is much more complex than we ever imagined. Now, it was easy to break down systems. Even when you spoke of systems, if you looked at people teaching about systems thinking, it still was, in a sense, broken down in the way people could understand. And some of people made linear connections between parts of the system. I think this COVID crisis has demonstrated that it's much more complex than we can ever imagine. And therefore, it cannot be handled by any one person, institution, or sector. It needs something very different, and it's demonstrated the absolute need for collaborative work. And collaboration is not something which goes with the individual narrative of leadership, where the one man waving the magic wand sitting at the top can solve all the world's problems. That is no longer going to work, because the one man waving the magic wand is not going to solve the problem of COVID. But on the other hand, he has to learn, how does he learn to work across in this enormous complexity of the ecosystem to demonstrate the real collaborative work that you need? Does he have the wherewithal, the leadership knowledge to do that? So we look at it a little ahead. So we are not, it's very strange. I used to hear words in the pre-COVID world about, in some workshops, a lot of people would ask me, how does it look like to demonstrate collective leadership? We have all these nice fashion statements in every sector, every subject that we take about, and leadership has its own fashion statements. And so we have all these different words: situational leadership, servant-based leadership, and so collective leadership is another word. And I would like to throw in one more word for the post-COVID world. We have, especially in the context of social distancing, and when people are not going to be physically working together, they're going to be remote locations. So the definition of togetherness is no longer about the same room or same office or same town even. We really don't know. It's going to be like this webinar from all over the world. So it's going to be, how are we going to operate in a world? How is leadership going to look like in a world where functionalities are going to be so distributed? So are we going to move away to a scenario of distributed leadership? And what does it mean? How does it look like? So to me, earlier, if it was about leaders crafting visions and inspiring people to translate that vision into reality, which is important. So firing up people to take up to a cause and getting everybody to address it. Now it's going to be more about playing the role of a gentle convener, a coordinator, finding system-driven solutions, where the leader is actually going to be present more by his absence, and which is an extraordinary quality which the current world is not prepared to understand, because the current world revolves around that magic figure placed on the pedestal, where he has to be very visible and present to provide solutions, to not actually to demonstrate his presence by his absence. And I think it's a very complex thing to wrap your mind around. So to me, in this post-COVID world, I look at leadership, forming the right mindset. It's about forming, getting the right skill sets too. So what's the new mindset? Not that it was not there earlier, but it's going to be accentuated, and it's going to be, there's going to be greater demand on this kind of mindset, is can we actually exercise leadership driven more by humility? And by humility, when I say humility, it's about coming to terms with our own lack of competence, or I would say even incompetence, and that incompetence not making us weak or diffident, but that incompetence inspiring us to acquire the competence. For that, you need the humility to learn. You also need to come to terms with your vulnerability, to be comfortable with your own inadequacies, to be comfortable with your incompetencies. But more importantly, you got to understand that leadership is going to be about your willingness to embrace chaos. Because we human beings are wired to constantly seek order. We are wired to seek equilibrium in everything we do. We get rattled by discomfort and disequilibriums. So, but now real leadership is going to be not running away and avoiding the disequilibrium, but coming to terms with this. You may not have a solution to it, but the fact that you can come to terms with it and you're willing to embrace this chaos, the disequilibrium, the uncertainty, you're willing to subsume your ego needs, you're willing to learn from all and sundry, not just from people you consider as important, that is going to be a different mindset. And from this mindset, we'll begin the journey to acquire new skill sets. And I'm just going to stick to 3 or 4 of these, again, for lack of time, and I'll possibly expand when we begin the question and answer session in a few minutes from now. I think one of the primary skill sets is the very definition of communication is going to alter. Communication, not from a technology point of view, but I think much deeper. So what is it that's going to alter from the way I see it? Is I think communication is not going to mean how do I, as a person maybe in a position of power, maybe in a position of importance, or as a person convening a larger group of distributed functions in different locations, teams working and operating from different settings, how do I communicate loss to people without creating panic or getting marginalized? Now, how do you tell the citizens of a country like India, 1.3 billion people, that you got to lose your income for the next 2 months? You got to forego your wages, or you can't do your daily work, or you are a migrant laborer, you can't go back home, nor will you get work where you're staying. How do you communicate this deep sense of loss? How do you communicate to somebody whose security revolved around getting up in the morning and going to a job and coming back at home with the daily wages to feed his family? How do you communicate loss to him without creating panic or getting marginalized? It's easy to scapegoat people in positions of power. You can easily blame somebody and say, when you watch television debates, you always see this, blaming somebody all the time. This party blaming the other party blaming this person. But without scapegoating anybody, how do you actually get people to face the problem? How do you communicate to people that you are the persons with the problem, and therefore you need to be the people with the solution? This is actually possible, and that's going to be how leadership is going to be defined. The ability to actually tell people that people with the problem must be the people with the solution. And then how do you actually communicate in a way where you're humble, but you don't sound despondent? You don't sound that, oh my God, the world is going to end. How do you communicate strength at the same time not be unrealistic? You can't tell people, come back to work tomorrow morning, everything is going to be okay. So you got to tell them that you got to be strong, you got to communicate strength, you got to actually demonstrate it, but you got to be realistic. And that level of authenticity is going to be real leadership in the coming days to come. And I think more importantly, how do you actually keep learning? How do you reach out across segments? How do you actually learn without sounding you're inadequate, that you're incompetent? Because whatever we say, I think a feeling of inadequacy can sometimes translate as paralyzing me from actually moving ahead itself. But how do you actually respond to your inadequacy by a desire to become adequate? So that's the kind of communication. So communication is not just going to be to the people outside you, far away from you, but communication with your own self. How are you going to start talking to yourself? What are the stories you're going to tell yourself? The explanatory notes you're going to give yourself every day. At the next level of skill set that I think is on how are we going to build relationships. This is going to be extremely critical because in this world of social distancing and staying apart, though it's not going to be the completely permanent normal, different variations are going to emerge. I don't know how air travel is going to look like, how many people can even sit in a seat. Airlines are used to putting people together in economy class, like cramping them up together. Is it going to work anymore? How are they going to reposition? A lot of things are going to change. Whether it's train travel, I remember when I used to stay in the tribal areas, the only mode of transportation were those four-wheeler jeeps. And it's something like you could never spot less than 20 people in each vehicle. That's the way people travel. And relationships in rural areas are very different. When you harvest your crop or when you're threshing your crop, every activity is by social contact and relationships. You can't distance people. You need next door neighbors to come and help each other. Urban areas, it's more easier to talk of social distancing. Rural economies don't thrive on distancing, actually thrives on coming together. So how are you going to be looking at relationships in this context? What is leadership going to look like? How are you going to deal with relationships which actually are going to be very non-transactional, less and less transactional, because distancing makes it less transactional. How are you going to deal with it? How are you going to be inspiring people and also getting inspired? Because generally we think the role of leadership is to inspire. We don't see it as a role to also get inspired, but this is going to be the new normal now. How are you going to subsume your need for ownership? How are you going to subsume the need for ownership of an idea that you want to put across? How are you going to subsume the need for ownership of the credit or subsume your ownership of credit for success? Because it's going to really determine how well you can build collaborative leadership. Earlier, they could have just been slogans in a leadership workshop, but now they need to become real DNA of a person exercising leadership. More importantly, I think what it's going to teach us is how do you appreciate roles? How do you actually perform your roles better? Because roles are going to be more important than anything else. So we need to really look at how do we start looking at what value a person brings to the table rather than what level of hierarchy is in. It's no longer about, am I the CEO, am I the boss? It's about what value do I get into a room. And relationships are going to be determined by the value a person brings in rather than the level of hierarchy that he's going to be in, which means structural processes to deliver on functions are going to be very different from no one, whichever sector it is going to be. Relationship is also going to mean how are you going to reach out to people who disagree more with you than people who agree with you. So this ability to build allies, to reach out and build coalitions is becoming very, very important in the way that COVID is being managed today. You need everybody along with you. It's not just the health system, the doctors, you need the police, you need the political system, you need the bureaucracy, you need the civil society organizations, you need the donors, you need corporates, suddenly need everybody. And everybody may not agree with the way to manage the problem, but how do you still reach out to them, build bridges, create allies, create a coalition, and that's going to determine how your skills of relationship are going to be, and therefore it's going to determine how you're going to function as a leader. So more importantly, I think, I'll just take a few more minutes, is that how do we move towards a paradigm where there's going to be a more evolved understanding of the self? This last 4 weeks, I think many of us, if you stand in front of the mirror, you would have seen different versions of yourself. For months, many of us might have felt that we're not doing justice to our families, we're not spending enough time with them. Suddenly, there's so much of time with our families, maybe we're not doing justice to the way we are spending time with them. We all talk of quality time, and maybe even the concept of quality time gets redefined. It is not just physical presence. Maybe physical presence 24/7 can actually cause problems. How do you deal with it? How do you deal with taking people for granted, which you were all this time, to actually now demonstrating value? It's going to be a challenge. I think it's going to be, pre-COVID era was about the outside and your ability to control the outside. I think the post-COVID era, most importantly, is going to be how are you going to deal with your inside? I think we're going to come to terms with understanding that leadership is going to be a fascinating spiritual journey for a lot of people. I think it's going to move away from just evolving, seeing leadership as from the level of a strategy to succeed, to seeing the whole world as one unified whole. It's something like a new feeling of oneness. And I think that new feeling of oneness is going to transcend the feeling of interconnectedness that is demonstrable today. And in that feeling of oneness, we're going to look for solutions. We're going to listen so intently that we can all together co-generate solutions, which means even the way we listen is going to alter. We're going to look at, we're not only going to come to terms with our insecurities, but we're going to stay grounded in a response to what beautifully the Bhagavad Gita talks of as the opposites. The way we're going to deal with pleasure and pain, with happiness and unhappiness, joy and sorrow, and all these things, the equanimity we're going to display, that is going to become critical as a leadership response. It's not just about being comfortable with the vulnerability, but using that moment of vulnerability to actually explore and discover our true inner strength. That's something very fascinating. It's a great journey, and I've been trying to explore that. How in that moment of vulnerability, earlier I used to think that comfort with our vulnerability itself was demonstration of leadership. But I think there's something deeper. Beyond the comfort that we can be with our own vulnerabilities, transcending that comfort and actually diving deep to exploring and discovering a true inner potential and strength. And that's going to determine what kind of leadership expression you're going to have. And I think it's also about, it's going to be, from now on, it's not going to be about the means, it's not about the end, because leadership is always about outcomes and what have you delivered and what is your success story. I think the definitions are going to change. It's going to be more about, not just about accepting failure, but it's going to be about redefining success itself. Earlier, everybody would talk about learning from your failures. But I think now, this generational shift is going to be about redefining success. It is no longer going to be about talking about a task being successfully completed, but I'm sure it's going to be about how we did it. It's going to be about the journey rather than the destination. I'm not saying the destination is not important, but I think the predominant narrative is going to focus on the how of it and the why of it rather than what did you achieve in the end of the day. So I think we're also going to learn what this COVID experience, at least as my observation analysis is, we're going to operate with a lot of respect for technical expertise, because recently, the last 2-3 years, we have had a lot of world leaders being very disdainful of technical expertise. So as though political common sense and street smartness was enough to run a country. So from that, there's a gradual recognition of technical expertise. If you look at all the major scientists and doctors and economists talking today, but I think real leadership is operating with the respect for technical expertise, but not being blinded by it, knowing how much it can give you and how much it can't give you. So we are going to learn to operate in a system where boundaries between subsystems are going to be blurred. We're going to operate in a world that will define, we got to remember, the COVID has also shown us that humankind is now defining newer ways to polarize people. I know of a few set of friends who are talking to me, we're talking doctor friends in their country. There's a new definition of ethics itself now. They're talking about who should be on that ventilator. Should it be a 26-year-old guy or an 80-year-old guy? When should we plug, for whom should we pull the plug off? There's a newer way of looking at polarization today. But leadership to me is when there are going to be forces pushing people towards different kinds of polarization, whether it's rural, urban, class polarization, caste polarization, religious polarization, political power polarization. I think real leadership is going to be people who are going to show the courage to stand against this temptation of choosing the easy way of polarization, but actually looking at the need to pull away from it. So it's going to be people who can actually demonstrate the leadership, communicate it in a language despite the fear of getting maybe assassinated, to pull people away from polarization. So I think leadership is now more critical than ever, a new mindset, a new skill set. But more importantly, it is not just going to be people at the table. This new leadership is not just going to look at people and voices that we know and hear, but this leadership is going to look for those unexpressed voices, the quality and ability to identify those unexpressed voices, the unseen interest, abstractions like the needs of the planet, needs of remaining organisms around the world. It's going to redefine the foods we eat, the way we eat, the respect that we show. even if that respect is going to be born out of fear of consequences, that may be the beginning. But I think we're going to create a new world with a new leadership, which will redefine three critical components of leadership. We're going to redefine what compassion will mean now. We have already spoken about how courage is going to look like. And I believe from now on, how the spirit of service is also going to alter. It's no longer going to be people that we see in front of us or the voices that we hear. It's going to be people unseen, not just people, just about life on this planet as we know it is going to change. So I'm going to pause here and stop here and then keep it open to listening to your questions and see if I can help understand them and then try to see what I could talk to you about them. So Nikita, if
yes, thanks so much for that, Badu. Absolutely. So we're looking at questions that people are sending in.
Okay.
So the first thing that some of what you were saying was around embracing chaos. The fact that the very paradigm of leadership is changing. So it will call for a lot of adaptation, of course, on the part of leaders and team members on the whole. And given all the uncertainty, given the rapid adaptation that the situation calls for, how do you propose leaders can also, preserve their own energy, self-care, because it is stressful. The uncertainty is grating and it's not easy to make these rapid shifts that one is being called to do. So what are ways to nurture oneself while also being able to nurture the communities, the organizations, the teams that we work with?
I think several experiments have actually been tried and people have used different words, different terminologies. This applies even in the pre-COVID world. But I would say that is going to gain more momentum and meaning now. I would answer it in two ways. I think we'll have to start looking at how do you look at leadership itself. And I believe leadership operates in four major domains. The expression of leadership. Most people limit the expression of leadership to a work domain. I was just looking at several questions that's been sent to me, and most of it is around the business place, the workplace. It's less to do with anything else. So, but I think the redefinition, the new narrative that's going to shift or give more prominence, I'm not saying it's not there, but it's going to get more prominence is we're going to look at four domains. The work domain is just going to be one of them. The second domain, especially in the world of social distancing that we're going to see, is how are we going to define, how do you respond to and exercise leadership from the small little domain of your families? And what does it mean to spend more time at home? Work from home is very easy, but we got to really understand it's working at home, which means it's going to be with a lot more people around you all the time. How do you deal with it? The third domain that I think is important and it's going to play out that way is how do you deal with close friends, people who are not your blood relatives or dependents on you, or neither are your work professional colleagues, but your neighbors, your friends at your football club, people you go to movies with or have a dinner with. How are you going to look at this from the concept of post-COVID world? And I think the most important is how are you going to deal with yourself? And how are you going to dive deep within you? I think the ways in which you respond to all this is going to determine how are you going to respond to the world outside. I put it this way, leadership was all about manifesting your qualities to operate on the external world or control of external nature. Now the new paradigm is going to be control of internal nature and the control of external nature, because how you are going to interpret and look at situations and make meaning out of them is going to be different. Are you going to allow that to accumulate and build stress in you? Or are you going to look at it from an observer perspective, develop your inner abilities to take a helicopter view of things, be dispassionate about it, be detached about the consequences? Actually, in one sentence, you're going to learn how to operate the way the Bhagavad Gita describes it. Don't look at it as a religious text, but if you were to just shift focus and say, it's about building your inner capacity to express yourself outside, I think that's how leadership is going to look like. I'm not sure if that answers your question completely, but if there's some other things.
Sure, thank you. I think in similar vein, there's also this tension between the traditional manner in which leadership gets transacted, a lot of which is, around accountability, results, and so on, while the current situation, of course, calls for compassion, empathy, accounting for the needs of others around us. How does one strike that balance?
I think like I mentioned earlier, it's about redefining what success means now. Because accountability is something which you hold a person accountable to deliver on a particular outcome. So if you start redefining what that outcome is, if that outcome is going to be defined as delivering on this, keeping your values intact or keeping your ethics intact, it's not just about doing something, but it's about also about doing something and also about how you did it. I think the moment you reframe the definition, I'm not saying the end result is not important, but if you frame the end result as how well did you do it? Did you do it with the compassion it deserved? Did you clearly understand there are several stakeholders to what you were handling, and where all those stakeholders, you cannot address them equally, but at least equitably can you look at their issues? Can you look at the value that you created for everybody touched by the problem? So these are going to be the way you're going to look at it, not just by your functional bottom lines. You're going to actually expand the definition of the bottom line itself. I think that is what is going to happen today. It's no longer about, it's strange. I'll give a small example. I think this rumor spread that bats carry the COVID virus. And there were a lot of places where in a desire to survive or the desire to be the only ones who should survive, people were cutting up trees which had large colonies of bats. I even saw an announcement by the forest department pleading, please don't do that. They don't carry the virus which infects human beings. I think that's the pre-COVID behavior. It's all about me and my survival. So preventing COVID means killing the bat. But that's not how we're going to redefine. The new metric of accountability is going to be, how do we ensure that the whole world learns to live together and we're able to manage this in a sense where it's the mitigate the risk for everybody involved in this equation. If the bat is carrying the virus, how do you take that into cognizance and still address it? And even if it were to be transmitting it to human beings, how do you manage it? So I think behaviors are going to revolve around solutions where we're going to look at all this as the problem and not just what happens to me as the problem. I think the definition of the ecosystem itself is altering. And that's what I was trying to say. How well we can come to terms with the complexity of what we're building is going to define your accountability frameworks, is going to define your definition of success itself.
Right. Great. Also, do you see indications that leadership in the post-COVID world will see more grassroots representation?
Absolutely. I think the leadership is going to be more democratized. I don't see any other way, because the moment you say, start looking around and say the unseen voices, it's not just about human beings. I think people whom we don't even represent as an entity. I think, in a very, if I can extend my thinking to that extent, you're even going to start thinking on behalf of viruses and bacteria and everything around in this world today. I'm not saying you will not give an antibiotic to a person suffering from a bacterial infection. That's not what I mean. But you're going to start looking at the entirety of the system in everything that you do. And you're going to take that into cognizance. Obviously, we cannot address everybody's problems together at the same time. That's too complex. But we are going to keep expanding our understanding of this. And therefore, you need voices which you never thought of. Even when there are voices which cannot be expressed in languages you understand, leadership is about building that ability to try to recognize it. And I think addressing those unseen interests, here listening to the unheard voices, or at least giving them the power to talk in a language in which they know, that is, to me, is democratizing leadership, and that's going to happen.
Right. Also, coming back to something you said about building allies at this point in time, that's going to be a critical part of leadership. So, in the development sector context, there's always been this power differentials between corporates that give money or agencies and foundations that give money and grassroots organizations seeking that. Do you think there's an opportunity to build this relationship more as that of co-creators, allies in fighting the pandemic? And if so, then how do you see that panning out?
If I were to answer it, maybe it may not sound concrete right now. I think this pandemic is a godsend in the way I'm looking at it. I'm not looking at this devastation, the death it's causing. I'm very sympathetic to all that's happening. But I think it's an opportunity, a milestone, which gives us an opportunity to shift gears. I think the world is now going to understand the current model of development, the current model of economic growth that we are all talking about. The consumer is driven, I have to have everything and I have to have it at the fastest possible pace. That's going to change. At whatever cost, development at any cost is going to change. And we are inevitably going to move this world where we are going to take the best of the public sector. And when I say public, I'm including the civil society groups and the government into it, where social value is what matters for these institutions. I'm not saying you're going to sacrifice profits. What I'm going to say is we are actually going to start living the triple bottom line. I actually would say the quadruple bottom line. We're going to look at the planet. We're going to look at people, profits, and peace, and not necessarily in that order, but these are going to be realities, and therefore the very definition of the very paradigm of economic growth is going to alter now. I think we are finally going to recognize that it is not about profit maximization, which is maybe even the COVID epidemic can be tracked back to that, but it's going to be about benefit optimization. So the moment you talk about optimizing benefits, the leadership that you need to build allies, it's necessarily going to make leadership democratic. It's necessarily going to make you reach out to other people. It's necessarily going to make you demand of changes of values, behaviors, which is not going to be easy. It's going to be a long run, but I think the beginning is coming. And I wouldn't be surprised, even within my lifetime, if we move towards it, because I don't think we have a choice as humanity. If we really want to survive as humanity, my guess is more of us, the critical mass is going to grow faster now because the COVID happened.
Right. Tempted to ask, and this is also a question from Govinda. Do you think the changes that we've been seeing or discussing are going to be enduring changes, or, being the stubborn race that we are, we're going to fall back into old ways very, very quickly?
I have a very simple answer. If the world demonstrates real leadership the way I have said, then people are going to be reminded it can't be business as usual. That is leadership. It's very easy to fall back into the comfort of the known. It's very easy not to succumb to the fears of the unknown. It's very easy to just tell yourself, I have a vaccine, I have the medicines, let's go back to business as usual. That's a way to do it. Let's spray the aeroplane with as many antiviral or whatever you can get, the antiseptic compounds, and then we can travel. It's very easy to say all that. And that's what I think is going to be counterfeit leadership. So I think the future is going to be, are we going to build a critical mass of people who genuinely want to express real leadership? And if we don't do that, I am not surprised. And a lot of experts have been talking about it, not just the virologists or the epidemiologists. A lot of people are talking about it. The current model is going to throw up increasingly more such crises. We haven't even seen, we only felt in different parts of the world today. We just talk of warming, climate warming, or we talk about all these issues, but they are going to be more pronounced and more dangerous and more challenging because they happen slowly. We don't see it. It's something like throwing a frog into cold water and heating it up slowly. It's going to die anyway, but it thinks nothing is going to happen. But COVID has just thrown the frog into boiling water, and therefore we are all responding immediately. But if we don't learn from this, and if we don't demonstrate real leadership to find sustainable, permanent solutions, change behaviors across a large number of people, and if you want to slip back into counterfeit leadership, which is very comforting, which is very popular, it makes you a hero, I think the world is going to lose out in that. And hopefully, nature is possibly the best teacher for us right now, and it's going to teach us to wake up. And the wake-up call is going to be sooner than later.
Right. Great. So, from the education perspective, Balu, what are the changes that you would like to see in the way that we are preparing kids and young people to, rise to the leadership challenge?
It's very strange. We talk of a knowledge-based economy, but we have somehow equated knowledge to qualifications. We have somehow looked as though getting a master's degree, getting it from the top universities around the world, that's what matters. I think education is going to be redefined as not just about information alone, but it's going to be about application of that information in a way in which is going to make this world a better place. And so acquiring it and securing degrees is not going to be a premium anymore. I feel personally, teaching in Ivy League, I know it's going to be a situation where the young of today, a generation which is, in my opinion, one of the questions earlier in the notes I had seen was, how is it going to look for the youth? I think they are going to be the ones who are best prepared to handle this. Because the youth of today love to lead a life of adventure, and facing uncertainty is an adventurous proposition for them. So they are going to do very well, and we got to learn from them. Education is no longer going to necessarily mean better employment. whereas knowledge is going to mean a better employment and employment for making something better. So I think employment is not going to be for personal aggrandizement or personal wealth creation. It's going to be about knowledge which is going to help you, enable you to create wealth which can possibly be used to address the problems of the world. And because I think the new generation is going to recognize that unless you really solve the world's problems, it's not going to help. So I think education is going to be teaching people how to generate private gains while ensuring public good. So that is going to be the new narrative. And I see most universities moving towards that. And they're going to discover new ways of doing it. It is, people are simply looking at it as a band-aid response of online teaching. I don't even think it's going to stop at online teaching. I do feel there's importance for professors to talk, interact with people. It's very important to build social collectives and fraternities and groups of people around the world and interconnectedness. All that is important from the global citizenship perspective. But finally, the narrative of why education, I think it's going to end up with how do you teach the people of today that ensure that you can actually enable to create private gains, but also ensure public good. That is going to be the new definition of how education is going to pan out.
Right. But just in a slightly different vein now, given your background in healthcare and your work with tribals, there's also curiosity around, whether you see, again, COVID-19 shifting global trends towards or away from socialized healthcare. Like practically, reasonably speaking, there's a lot of discourse around it. But from your experience, what do you expect is likely to happen?
I think, at least I'm a man, full disclosure. I always believe that health and education have to be public goods. That's been my deepest conviction. And that does not alter, it actually gets reinforced now. I think increasingly, if you look at the way, if you just take India, I'm not talking about other countries because I don't have enough data or information, but I can definitely talk from the perspective of what India has been doing or what other countries are failing to do. I can draw inspiration from that and say the response to the crisis in this nation has been best met by the public system. I'm really worried that if it really spreads to rural India, whether the rural healthcare systems in the public space is completely prepared to manage it. It might be, but it's to be seen. But I think increasingly we're going to understand that strengthening public health systems is the way forward. But I also think one more space that I would like to have the confidence to jump into, I think the state is also going to recognize that there's a lot of talent and there's a lot of resource bandwidth in the private sector. And there are going to be new ways of engaging the private sector to ensure that public goods are delivered to people. So it's not just about, what you saw in Ayushman Bharat about paying 5 lakh rupees to people who are sick and admitted to hospitals, even if it's the private sector. We are going to bring in more innovative models of one, strengthening public health systems to respond to crises like what we're seeing now. And two, engaging more of the private sector, at least during times of crises, the boundaries between public and private vanish. Now, if the health minister or the prime minister of this country would ask me one prescription that I could give, I would even say setting up a national emergency response team or a command and control structure nationally, like the Epidemic Diseases Act or the NDMA Act gives enormous power to the government. Where it could be during the time of a war, it could be during times of pandemic, to just integrate delivery of health systems, to remove margins of public and private during this crisis at least. And I see health systems around the world moving towards that very gradually.
Great. Thank you so much. So rounding it all up, Balu, and also before we jump to the last question, I want for you to take it in the context of the book you're in the process of finishing, Leadership Lessons for Daily Living, which I'd love to share with our attendees. ILSS is co-publishing, and the book should be out in June, so look forward to that. But with that book in mind and all of your grassroots experience, curious to know what you think are the lessons we can learn from grassroots leaders to build a more holistic leadership framework.
You should read my book.
We will.
This is all about the lessons that we always pretend or we imagine that leadership has to come from people sitting at the top of the pyramid, that we fail to notice, and that's what I mean as democratization of leadership itself. We fail to notice people at every level in different contexts. And you don't have to be a 24/7 leader. That's again a myth that somebody can be a leader and you can be 24/7 at it. So I think at different levels, and most of the narratives I quote, all the narratives I quote in the book are real life narratives, leadership lessons that I learned from indigenous tribal leaders, from street vendors, from auto drivers, and from people of this kind around the world, whom generally society dismisses of as ordinary, and the extraordinary lessons I learned from them. So I'm going to keep your excitement alive. It's like a trailer. I don't want to reveal too much, but I'm coming out with what will work. And these are lessons which all of us can practice. And it's going to be pragmatic, authentic, livable, realistic leadership that you can gain from looking at these lessons from ordinary people. And they've been living this for generations. It's just that we didn't see them as people with leadership, and we can learn. Before you actually pull the plug, there's one question which is private gate with public good. It's not gate, it's private gains. So it's private, enabling people to ensure private gains at the same time ensuring public good. So I don't know if that answers your question. I know I've not let out too many things about it.
No, absolutely. We'll keep the excitement alive. And, the phrase livable leadership just struck a chord. So we'll certainly keep
it. In one sentence, Nikita, I would say this book is about it's going to be a spiritual journey. And in the spiritual journey, you'll be understanding leadership. Spirituality is a phrase which we have made it a cliche and we kept it out there for somebody to live in the Himalayas or to stay in an ashram. I think in one sense, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa says it so beautifully. He said life is about, you got to be like a lotus leaf. You got to be in the water, but at the same time not get wet by it. So this book is about that extraordinary spiritual journey, which is going to make you exercise leadership, where you're going to be in this world doing good, at the same time not losing out on evolving yourself from inside. So I'll leave it at that. And that's all about the book.
Lovely thought. Thank you so very much. Just to remind our attendees, the book is expected sometime around June. So I'll urge you to look out for that. And thank you so very much for your time, Balu. It was a very rich session. I think it's helpful that beyond frameworks, we're talking about ourselves, our capacity to deal with chaos and really live the values we talk about. So we'll end on that note. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you all so much. I know there are a lot of questions I couldn't really answer because there's so many of them. And if Nikita can put them together, I can at least go through them and mull over it. So thank you all so much for the wonderful evening and for being with us for this entire hour, and looking forward to interacting more with all of you at some time in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Nikita, for the excellent